Welcome to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. And this broadcast will be in keeping with our more abbreviated format, so I'm going to have to talk really fast to get it all out to you. And it'll probably sound like it's all a bunch of chatter if I don't be careful and don't talk so fast. Today we have a very interesting subject. We've been giving you on and off along the way pieces of information about different aspects of sick care versus health care. Somehow the two have gotten intermingled, and in this country of ours we refer to the system as it stands as health care, when in fact it's really sick care because people aren't very healthy. So we're going to kind of call this one kind of exposing the health scam of about $2.7 trillion. Now, I want that number to sink in. Now, remember that a billion is 1,000 million, and a trillion is 1,000 billion. So we're talking about $2.7 trillion that are being spent in this country every year. And guess what? I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is buying you. Now, I just have been pulling up some numbers, and it's kind of interesting. One that we pulled up, for example, was actually information given by the World Health Organization, WHO, and the UN and the World Bank. And it's under something called the Bloomberg Rankings, the world's healthiest countries. Now, since we have the most expensive health sickness bill in the world, you would expect that we would be right up at the top of this list if we're spending more money. And by the way, it appears from all the numbers that 50% of the drugs consumed in the world are consumed in the United States. So with all of that, and if the healthcare system is doing its job, we would anticipate that we would have to be pretty close to the top, if not to the top. However, according to these rankings, guess who's number one? Singapore. Well, if we're not number one, we certainly ought to be 2 or 3 or 4. Let's see. 2 is Italy. 3 is Australia. 4 is Switzerland. 5 is Japan. 6 is Israel. Nope, it's not up there any place. If we go right down the list, number 17 is Hong Kong, but we're not above them, and we keep going down the list, and we get down to number 28 is Cuba. Number 29 is South Korea. Number 30, the United Arab Complex. Number 31, Kuwait. Remember, that's the country that had all the oil wells burning for ages and polluting their environment, and they were almost wiped out by another country. And they're 31. Guess where we are? We're number 33. Now, that's really exciting. It only cost us $2.7 trillion to be ranked number 33 in the world. Now, I hope this sinks in. I'd like to say that this is probably one of the most important broadcasts I've done in terms of really digging into the problem as much as I'm going to have time for, and also offering a possible solution. So we want to, first of all, expose the scam, and I say it's a scam because if you're offered something that's supposed to provide something for you and you pay for it, and what you were offered you didn't get, and the people offering it knew that you weren't going to get it, to me that represents a scam. So first of all, as I say, number 33 in the world Not a very good rating for $2.7 trillion. Now, I have another report here. And now what I'm telling you, that all this stuff, is I'm presenting the problem. And once I present the problem, I'm going to suggest some solutions, and the bill would come in at a fraction of this $2.7 trillion. My guess would be it would be in the billions and not necessarily in the high billions. But it's going to require a total rethink of health and sickness. Now the next set of numbers, and incidentally those numbers were compiled in 2012, so we're not talking about back along the way, we're talking right up current. Here's another from April 2012 put out by the Congressional Research Service in the United States, and it is the infant mortality rate. Now, of course, we should rank very well there. I mean, part of that $2.7 trillion is for our birth, infant, and pediatric care. So we must have a high ranking in that. And as I go down the list, I find that lo and behold, guess what? The United States is down at number 31. 33 in general health of everyone, 31 in infant mortality rates for $2.7 trillion. Now this isn't some report compiled somewhere else criticizing us. This is put out by our own Congressional Research Service and came out in April of 2012. Okay, so that's starting to give you a little bit of information about it. Now, some more information has been compiled, and that has to do, again, it's talking about the United States spending $2.7 trillion annually. That means that in our country we pay twice the amount of money per person as most other industrialized nations on health care. Twice per person. Now that ought to mean that we would be twice as healthy if what we were being provided for that $2.7 trillion was doing the job. Now see, I have to think about this. I think it's time for people to wake up. We've been living in a fog or something, or maybe these current zombie movies that are catching on are really depicting where we all are. I don't know, but we don't seem to be tuned in, and we keep handing out more and more money and hoping that we're going to get healthier and healthier, but I have to say it's not happening. Now here was another study had to do with life expectancy. Male life expectancy in the U.S. versus other countries. And for it says the life expectancy for the male was ranked 29th in the world versus 33rd for female. And guess who was number one on the list as for the highest life expectancy for both male and female was Japan. Now, see, that raises a lot of questions, or at least it certainly does to me. Something isn't right. Now, of course, part of our waste, and again, this is some information that popped up, part of our waste is, or our bill is that $750 billion has been annually wasted on unnecessary services, $210 billion. Inefficient delivery of care, $130 billion. Excess administrative costs, $190 billion. Inflated prices, $105 billion. And while we're talking about prices, I don't know if you know or don't know, but you know there are no regulations related to pricing in this company. And we not only consume half of the drugs in the world, but we pay the highest bill for these drugs of anybody anywhere else in the world. I know I ran across information from France that has a committee that meets at least 2 to 3 times a week reviewing drug prices, and they put a cap on them. But not in this country. They can charge anything they want. And it so happens that we're the only country in the world that has prescription drugs being advertised on television and all the media right direct to the consumer, encouraging them to go to their doctor and get this drug. Now, you know that there's something about the suggestion of illnesses that if you have them mention some symptoms, and you suddenly think, well, gee, I might have one or two of those symptoms. Maybe I better go see my doctor. And that's what, of course, the ad says, go see your doctor and see if it's right for you. Now, that would be good if, in most cases, the doctor really knew all the ins and outs of the drug, but that isn't necessarily true. I have many acquaintances who are pharmacists, and many times they catch that the doctor didn't find out from the patient that they were taking certain things, and what he prescribed would be not only in conflict, but in some cases could be fatal. But he didn't know that, and I look at the training in drugs that the doctor gets versus a pharmacist that has to go to now, 7 or 8 years of school just studying drugs. And I know that a doctor in a 120 to 140 or 50 hour pharmacology course is not going to know anything close to what the pharmacist knows about how the drugs are operating in the body and what they're in conflict with. But anyhow, we are paying inflated prices. We're paying more for the drugs here, and every time something comes up that people go someplace else and buy them, we discourage them. When I say we, not me, I'm saying the pharmaceuticals. Oh, well, you know, that may not be the same if you buy it out of Canada as it is in the U.S., and you buy it up there for half the price of here. Well, the reason is in Canada they won't let them sell it higher, but in this country, as I say, they can sell it for whatever they want. They can make a little bottle in an ampule of a chemotherapeutic agent that might cost 25 or 50 cents, and they can sell it for you for $2,000 or $3,000, and that's perfectly all right. But you know, I'm thinking about natural health. If you sold somebody a bottle of vitamin pills for $200 or $300, they would cry outlandish, terrible. It's being you're taking advantage of people. It's awful. But if I make something for 50 cents and sell it for $3,000, and I do it under the auspices of the pharmaceutical industry, nobody ever questions it. They just pay the bill and say, gee, wow, how come our bills are so high? Okay, improper payments, $70 billion, and fraud, $75 billion. Now, that makes up about $750 billion. Of course, it just goes down the drain. My suspicion is, if we addressed the real problem and implemented procedures and programs to correct the problem of health, that we could probably do it for the $750 billion that's going down the drain trying to sustain and implement a system that is not helping. And when I say it's not helping, if you look at all of this money and you ask yourself the question, are people healthier today than they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago? The answer is no. I had to laugh because a few years ago, out in California, there was a dispute going on between the doctors and the hospitals. And it seems to me it was Los Angeles, but I could be wrong. Anyhow, remember, this dispute was going on, and so finally, the doctor said, we're going on strike. We're not going to come to the hospital. We're not going to admit anybody to the hospital. Anyhow, within the 2 or 3 weeks they were on strike, the death rate dropped 30%. Now, that was a documented fact. So guess what? They went back to work, and I've never ever heard a threat again of doctors striking against the hospital. So basically, the less treatment, the better, it seems to me. And of course, I have a lot of information, and we certainly don't have time to cover it all. But I've known over the years of this type of thing that no treatment in many cases is the best treatment, especially when you're treating with the kind of things that are being presented today to treat. every year the antibiotics, the number that are prescribed go up every year. The price of the antibiotics go up. And when you get to the point that you're paying $20 to $30 for one pill, if I offered a patient a vitamin C capsule for $10, they would think that that is the most unscrupulous, ridiculous thing you could do, but they'll sell a drug for $20 a pill, or even more now. I have no idea because I don't always follow the newest increases, but I do know that it's pretty high. So at any rate, we think about all of this, and I watch it. I've watched it over the years. I've been in the natural health field almost 40 years. I studied all of the types of medicine, all the so-called schools of medicine. I'm familiar with them, especially historically as well as currently. And I've had to study pharmacology, and I would say I put as much, if not more, hours in as the average MD does in their training on pharmacology. And I understand how the drugs work, and of course I also know that the drugs are not designed to cure anything. The drugs are designed to manage symptoms. I have to repeat, and I've said it before, and I say it again, that the symptoms are not a disease. The symptoms are your body attempting to deal with the poison that's in your body. Now, we've talked about Houma toxicology before, and those of you who have heard my lectures or been to my seminars or whatever, at some point or the other have been exposed to Houma toxicology. But basically what it is an understanding of how the body gets sick and how it gets well. Now, it's interesting because in recent years I've gotten interested in going back and studying some of the history of medicine, especially in this country, but primarily this country, the UK and Germany and Austria, France, and so forth. And it's interesting what they knew way back. I mean, I'm talking about going back into the 1800s and all the way up through the middle of the 1900s, seeing what was being done and what they knew and what kind of results they were getting and how healthy people are. And beyond a shadow of a doubt, people were healthier back then. It's not so that no one ever got sick, and it's not so that people didn't die. They did, but the fact is that they were healthier than we are now. And they weren't paying out $2.7 trillion for the health bills to do that. The average country doctor or even small town doctor had no blood labs, had no imaging labs, had no wide array of pharmacological drugs to work with. But yet people were healthier and lived a long time, contrary to what we've been led to believe. And I've told you before about the way that the medical profession in this country calculates life expectancy is based on a series of probability factors that's been skewed for years because of the big 1918 so-called Spanish flu epidemic. And because of that skewing, when they first set the numbers up years ago, it made it look like that we were not living long at all. If I recall, the very first one they did was like men were in the late 50s and I think women in the early 60s. Now, every few years they bring up these numbers again and say, look, it's improving. We're helping people. We have a longer lifespan. But you know, that is not really true, because if you read a study that was done by 2 Harvard researchers, they went back for the last 200 years and did an investigation where they could find birth and death records and could actually do verifying. And they came up with an interesting factor, which they call the vitality factor. And they said that the average life span, now see, we're not talking average life expectancy, which is a probability number. It's an imaginary probability number that may or may not be true. And because it always depends in probability what factors you've taken into consideration. The fact is that every year since 1918, means that it looks like that we're going to expect to live longer because we are less affected by the skewing that took place when they originally set up the formulas. Now, the Harvard people came up with a study, and they found that the average person for the last 200 years has been 85 years old. There were people that died before that, and many that lived to over 100, but the average lifespan was 85. And I'm convinced that there's plenty of centenarians and so forth that go back, and in my own family and in other families I've known, barring an accident or something unusual happening, those people were living a long time and healthier. And they weren't being broken by a $2.7 trillion sick bill. They didn't need it. They rarely went. When I was young, hardly anyone went to a doctor. Occasionally, if something happened, if you broke your arm or you got a bad cut and you needed sutured, so accidents or emergency medicine, but they didn't have all the stuff going that they have now. And the average doctor, as I mentioned earlier, didn't have all the tools to work with, but yet people were living a long time and they were living healthy. The only times that we ran into problems is when people got into areas that were toxic and they got poisoned by the local city, or they got into an area where they could not get good food and they were eating toxic or rancid food and so forth. Those people began to develop health problems. But in those areas where people were growing their own food or eating food that was grown locally in good soil, those people were healthy. So anyhow, now we have, and as I was saying earlier, this toxemia issue, and I found that way back in the 1926 is when this Dr. Tilden was his name, Dr. J.H. Tilden, M.D., he realized after several years of doing regular medicine as he had been trained, because this modern medicine thing started in the early part of the 1900s, and as the pharmaceuticals grew and put out more drugs and they learned how to make synthetic molecules and patent them and make very expensive drugs, then guess what? People started getting sicker, and he began to realize that the real problem was not being addressed. So he wrote a book, and he republished it the last time in 1935. And the name of the book is called Toxemia Explained. And what he said is, or what he subtitled it, The True Interpretation of the Cause of Disease. How to cure is an obvious sequence. In other words, if you know what the real cause is, then you know how to correct it. He says, an antidote to fear frenzy and the popular mad chasing after so-called cures. Now, this was already going on back then. The people got something, and they thought, well, there must be a magic pill out there someplace, and so they would take off looking for the magic cure-all drug. But he realized that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was toxemia. And toxemia means that your body has become poisoned. And you cannot, for whatever reason, get rid of it. And we don't have time to go into all the specific details, but I'm saying he found out that toxemia was a major problem. Now, when I tie that in with all the other work I mentioned before about the miracle men who really discovered, these were doctors, MDs, who discovered that people were sick because they were deficient. And they were deficient because they were eating food that was deficient, and they were eating food that was deficient because it was growing in soil that was deficient. And so when they corrected the soil, the people's problems began to disappear, and when they fed people good food right along, they weren't getting sick with all these illnesses. So bottom line is that they found out that cardiovascular problems, cancer, neurological problems, behavioral problems, immunological problems, all these problems are not a disease that's attacking you, but it has to do with your deficiency. And of course the key of all those deficiency items are minerals. You know, vitamins are easier to get, and our body can do a lot about converting or synthesizing vitamins. But when it comes to the minerals, those are the basic blocks that have to come from the earth into the food and into your body. Now, you can supplement minerals, but many times they don't get utilized very well unless they are done the way nature does it to begin with. Nature has a substance produced by bacteria at the root of the plants. And that substance is produced by a bacterial form that lives in harmony with the plant at the roots, and they produce something called humic acids, one of which is fulvic acid. Fulvic acid acts as a chelator to grab onto the minerals in the soil or the clay, depending on what you're dealing with, and put it in an ionic form that can be absorbed into the plant and becomes a part of the plant. Then any animal or human that eats the plant picks up those minerals and can make use of them. And interestingly, once the mineral is released from the fulvic acid, it grabs onto toxic things in your body and pulls it out of your body and cleans it. So having good soil, producing good food, and good food being put in your body not only makes you healthy, makes all the biochemic processes that need to go on that helps them to do that, then we have an answer to good health. But if you don't have those, as I say, they found out along the way, and there were doctors who made supplements starting in the 30s, and that helped people get better, but you had two choices then. You had to keep taking those supplements, and it still wasn't the same, because we're going to be doing a program just on the soil, but right now, just saying that the best way to get these minerals into your body is by eating food that was grown in soil that, number one, has minerals, and number two, that they have not killed off the bacteria that produce the fulvic acid that grabs onto the minerals. Now, however, with all the commercial growing that took place in this country around the turn of the century, they already were depleting the soil, and they only throw enough basic things back in, a very few things, to get the plant to grow. And as long as it looks like a vegetable and people are willing to buy it and eat it, then the companies that grow that are not worried about replenishing. If you're willing to pay for it, and the same thing is even happening with organic, because I bought organic food that I know that is not very good. I mean, it didn't have the pesticides and so forth, but if you grow organically, which is the process of growing, in bad soil or depleted soil, the food still will not have the good minerals then that are necessary. And when you study biochemistry, you find out that the minerals help all the things in your body carry on the processes. In other words, they act as cofactors to make everything work, and plus, the minerals actually help make up the structure of the body. But they do wear out, and they have to be replaced. They lose their energy, and the body is ready to expel them and replace with new high-energy minerals. But if it isn't in the food, where are you going to get it? And if you try to get it from the supplements, there's a lot of supplements that are garbage that are made from synthetic chemicals. They're not even real products. They've ruined them the way they've put them together. And so you can't really depend on a lot of the stuff you buy unless you really know the source. So anyhow, we've got a major problem, and that's why we're spending $2.7 trillion for ineffective healthcare, which I say is a scam. Of course, now everybody's been all excited because this new Healthcare Act has come out, and it's called, I'm putting on my rose-colored glasses because when everybody heard it, it was called the Affordable Health Care Act. But the interesting thing is that when you really get into it, number one, it's not very affordable. Number two, it's going to cost a fortune to implement. Number three, a lot of people will not be able to afford the affordable health care. And it's going to be higher than ever, and there's already evidence of that, and there's already been major changes going on with large corporations because they're not going to be able to afford to pay what it's really going to cost for all of this health care. And on top of it, many people are going to end up without it, period, and have to pay a fine, which is really nothing but another tax, because they can't get the health care. They can't afford it. And it's going to cost a lot of money. So I say, forget the rose-colored glasses and wake up. And I think what's going to happen, all of this health stuff that has been poo-pooed by medicine, saying you need real drugs that's coming from the quacks, is going to be where you're going to have to go to get well. And I'm saying, first of all, get rid of all the health care and let people have to pay for their own rather than pay for a plan that they cannot afford and it may never work, and get into doing things that are going to make them healthy, which is much, much less expensive. And if the government wants to do anything, let them go out and insist that the food being sold in the market has nutrients in it, and if not, give incentives for the growers to correct the soil and put out healthy food. And I dare say that we're going to see that health bill come down like crazy if we do that, because I've been working with people for 40 years and I've watched people's health turn around many, many times from incurables. And I didn't have time even today to talk about some other aspects of the big $2.7 trillion treatment plans of what it really does. We didn't have time to get into that. We've mentioned it on and off, pieces of it here and there, and it could be a whole broadcast just on that. Anyhow, this is meant to be a bit of a wake-up call. Come out of the clouds, come out of the fog, open your eyes, and start looking at the reality of where we are, and we are not better for 2.7 trillion, and it's not going to be stopping at 2.7 trillion. It's going to go higher, and we're going to still be sicker. And there's other numbers. I had some others I was going to talk to you about. There's not even time for it. And as I say, I'm trying to keep these a little shorter. So we'll probably be doing something more on this, especially when we get into the soil. I'll be talking about what really represents healthy soil and how having real healthy food can make you have a healthy life at a fraction of the cost of all this outlandish health care, not even including the $750 billion fraud stuff that's going on, that's the part of it. Anyhow, it was nice to be with you again, and you can go to our website, and we keep putting new information, new pages on, and then you can put on our forum if you have something you'd like us to talk about and or ask questions, and you can go click from there to go to our alternative health and prevention site and find out something about what I do at my office. It was nice to be with you again. Until the next broadcast, be healthy.